Well, it's quite good because we've obviously opened with knowing that scientists don't know anything very much.
Sorry.
And 15 minutes to cover this topic is quite ambitious. So my job is to give you a very brief overview of the issues of unsustainable fisheries. So we tend to think of fish as food, but fish is actually wildlife. But it is also food, and as was mentioned earlier, billions of people around the world are completely dependent on fish as their major source of protein. But let's think about fish as wildlife just for a moment, and that's what I like to do in my role. This is a map of the global species richness of fish, with the darker colours showing the most species-rich areas, and you see real hotspots of biodiversity, particularly in Southeast Asia, of marine species. If we look at work that we do at the Zoological Society with WWF to look at trends over time, this is looking at about 1,500 species and many populations, and this just gives you an overall picture of trends over time, with marine species on the far right, and what you can quickly see is an element of decline and the situation being worse in a tropical environment than it is in the temperate environment. The situation on Earth isn't brilliant at the moment. This rather unwieldy graph looks at extinctions and basically says right now we're at a level of 1,000 times higher extinction rates than we know from the fossil record, with 10 times higher than that predicted in the future. So we're losing species at a really abnormal rate, and that's down to one species, and that's us. If we look at the World Conservation Union, the IUCN, they have the standardised method to measure threat of species, the IUCN Red List, and we find fish species actually featuring at the highest level of threat. So the southern bluefin tuna is a critically endangered species, which is even more endangered than something that perhaps is iconic for conservation, the panda. And the reason for this, if we look at analysing all the causes of decline across all of the most threatened, or across all threatened fish species, is quite clearly fisheries. There are other factors contributing, but fisheries is by far and away, for the marine environment, the most serious problem. And species have become near extinction because of those fisheries. In a recent publication by IUCN with ZSL, called Priceless or Worthless, we asked all the IUCN specialist groups to identify species that were likely to go extinct in the next 5 years. And 2 fish species that were commercially fished, the angel shark and sawfish, are in that list. So we are at the point of losing species because of fishing activity. With rarity comes value. If we look at the value of a single fish, a bluefin tuna in 2009 was worth £125,000, which rose in January this year. One was recorded on the market selling for £500,000. That's for one fish. And that's because the scarcity has increased their value. And the global fish trade as a whole is worth a significant amount, so 92 billion at first sale, but much more if you consider fish processing and other factors. Unfortunately, one of the biggest problems in creating unsustainable fisheries is there's too many boats out there fishing, 4.3 million boats at the most recent estimates, and the number of fish that they're catching is decreasing all the time. And while the number of the boats has stabilised or even decreased a bit, unfortunately, with the increase in technology and availability of more efficient gear, they're basically still able to catch more fish. And these advancing technologies are making it worse because we can access new places. Basically, there's nowhere safe for fish to go. This shows the increased depth over time from 1950s to the 2000s, and basically our ability to fish deeper and deeper over time. And while we tend to think of artisanal or subsistence fisheries, so small coastal communities who are catching fish to eat, as being much more sustainable, unfortunately we know very little about most of these fisheries, and they are significant when combined. So 25%, a quarter of the global marine catch, comes from these small coastal fisheries, often using a wide variety of gear that's again changing over time and catching pretty much anything that goes. There is shifts in trends, so now almost half the species that provide our protein come from aquaculture, but this has its own suite of problems that I'm not going to touch upon tonight, and the environmental impacts of some aquacultures are really concerning, although fortunately there are responsible practices too. So the consequence of all this is not great. Our icons of the oceans, the wonderful sharks, rays and tunas, the open ocean predators, key parts of the ecosystem, 90% gone. Many of these have also gone as a result of untargeted fisheries or bycatch. So if you go out to catch cod or tuna or something else, you don't just catch them, you catch all sorts of other things too. And while we've heard about dolphins, seabirds and sharks being caught out of these fisheries, there's also major problems with some of the smaller fisheries, particularly for things like shrimp, where you are catching all sorts of small fish, invertebrates, and seahorse here in the middle that are part of those shrimp trawl catches, which can discard up to 90% of the catch to catch the shrimp. The consequences of this is that we're basically fishing our way down the food web. We've started off taking out all of the big predators, we're working our way down to the smaller fish and invertebrates. And this is most extreme in some places where we actually see the fisheries that are ending up really just catching jellyfish. And this has been attributed through scientific research to be due to overfishing and also combined with other changes that are going on, such as particularly climate change. And this is really important to remember, is that we're not just looking at one issue tonight, we're discussing one issue, but there's lots of different contributing factors affecting change, from pollution to climate change and so on. So these all really combine to cause a massive negative effect on these species. This is one of the communities where I work, and I think it just summarises the situation and the pressure on the marine environment. This is a small community in the Philippines where there's not an inch of space left. But these people are completely dependent on fish for food, for income, for their livelihoods. And when you start thinking about the effects of climate change on these communities, it gets even more scary than that picture is. Governments have made significant commitments. So 168 governments around the world have signed various treaties over time and come up with a series of commitments that are ranging, and I'll just run through these now. So relating to the oceans, our governments have signed up around the world for sustainable management to maintain and restore stocks by 2015, and to take an ecosystem approach to fisheries management, so not just to consider the target species. Unfortunately, these methods are really not well developed, and there's no indication that that commitment will be met. Changes have happened. If we look at fisheries management measures, one of the most well-known one is relating to whales. And you can see here that by closing the fishery for southern right whales, a really fantastic increase over time. The albatross, vulnerable to many fishing methods, has responded well to changes in gear to reduce bycatch, but you still see declines going on. Whereas other symbols of our ocean, really high-profile species that we think of getting a lot of conservation attention, like turtles, still undergoing massive decline. We certainly haven't fixed it yet. Other commitments: let's remove harmful subsidies that's propping up the fishing industry. It's operating in Europe at a 5% loss at the moment, and yet we continue to pump money into the system to prop up the overcapacity of the fleet, illegal and unregulated fishing. And the value of these subsidies is, at 2003, was 16.2 billion. There's obviously a huge opportunity here to reallocate these funds to reducing the fleet, to introducing more sustainable gear, and to ocean protection, and coming up with a suite of opportunities to make things better. Illegal, unregulated and unreported fisheries are another commitment, although unfortunately this is only voluntary, and as you'd imagine there's a variation in how well implemented that is. But illegal fishing accounts for $23 billion every year, and unreported and unregulated catches remain a problem everywhere, particularly where you're talking about subsistence fishing in coastal communities with mixed fisheries that are traded at sea and very, very complicated to monitor and regulate. 172 countries committed under the 2010 Convention on Biodiversity to increase marine protection to 10% by 2020. This is the current state of marine protection, and I think you can probably guess that's not 10%. So the yellow areas are those that are protected. Some of these are simply fisheries management zones, and some of these are fully protected. And unfortunately, the data at the moment don't enable us to sort out which of those are fully protected. The other thing to note is the paler blue areas are the exclusive economic zones around countries. The darker blue is high seas. That's unregulated. That is very, very difficult to manage and control. So we have a huge shortfall in marine protection. Marine protected areas are important because if you stop fishing, you kill fewer fish, and then you have more fish. You also have the opportunity to restrict damaging activities. This is a satellite photo of shrimp fishers operating in the South China Sea, which looks like ploughing field, which is what it is. And it also provides an opportunity to protect biodiversity. And they work. I could talk about this for a very long time, but extensive scientific studies have shown that basically if you stop fishing in areas and allow them to recover, you get more fish. They're bigger, they're more diverse, and the habitat is better too. And they work in both tropical and temperate environments. However, at the moment, they're very skewed to protect some habitats and not others. So deep sea mounts and open ocean is very poorly protected, as are marginal habitats like mangroves. It's constantly challenged whether they work for migratory species or not. And the other thing that's always challenged is how effectively are they enforced? If we set up these areas, are they just paper parks? So the bad news at the moment is only 2.3% of our oceans are protected, and that's just any kind of protection. So in some cases, that's just use of different gear. The other thing is that the 2010 target was exactly the same as the 2000 target, and governments just went, oops, we didn't quite manage it, so we'll just move it by 10 years, which anybody who works in business, if your performance was that bad, I would think would be slightly more accountable. The other problem is that the median size of these is 500 hectares, so to achieve those targets by 2020, we need about 10 million more 500 hectare MPAs. And anyone who works in conservation feels a huge sense of triumph if you achieve one in a year. So that's a really scary, well, it was a scary statistic when we worked it out. The other bad news, this is one of our ocean discoveries, the blobfish, discovered as part of the Census Marine Life, who I adore. Is that it's difficult to implement sustainable methods. Anything multilateral is slow. Unfortunately, fisheries don't recover on a political cycle, and our societal values are based on consumption, and increasingly so as we become more and more disconnected with our oceans. And the human population is growing, so it will have doubled by 2050 on current projections. The good news is, it may not be great, but we actually know what's going on. For a long time, we didn't. We have no excuses now. We know exactly what's going on, how wrong it's going. We also know what to do. In fact, 160-odd governments have said that they'll commit to doing that. They've signed up on our behalf to do that. They just haven't done it yet. There are solutions available, not all of them, but there are solutions, and consumers are more engaged. So there's increased awareness, the end of the line, and fish love. Consumer choice, which I think David's going to talk more about, but we have tools available to help us when we go to our restaurants or supermarkets to help us know what we can buy with a clearer conscience. The conservation community is working together. The Marine Reserves Coalition was set up last year, NGOs working to push for more marine protection to give a sound scientific evidence base. And myself, I've been involved, and the Zoological Society particularly, in trying to implement new marine protected areas that range from the largest marine protected area in the world, the British Indian Ocean Territory, the fully protected Chagos Archipelago, through to small community-managed marine protected areas in the Philippines. We have to keep building the evidence base, and my team are involved in some really exciting new technology that is monitoring fisheries without depending on catching them, but using video technology, as well as the more standardized and regular reef monitoring techniques or underwater surveys. We're looking at all the tools available. So CITES, the International Trade in Endangered Species, has not been regularly used for fisheries because fisheries are not wildlife, but things like seahorses, which I've been involved with through Project Seahorse for many years, has all seahorses listed under CITES, and we're using this as a demonstration model for how CITES can work to make the international trade and international fishery sustainable. And finally, reaching new audiences. This was an absolutely amazing event we did last year with Selfridges, which was completely off the wall, but brought the awareness about the issues to a completely new audience. Thank you.
I'm glad you finished on the consumer picture, you know, when Selfridges made that bit of London an effective marine protected area. And I see, you know, supermarkets doing the fish of the day, and fish and chip shops using real names for the fish that we're eating, not just calling it rock cod or something, you know. And I just wonder how given the size and the scale of the problem as you've defined, how effective do you think, you know, we as consumers really are in influencing these big corporations and governments as to how we should fish?
Hugely.
Hugely,
yes,
that's
sorry,
what
hugely.
we want to hear.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is very much David's area of expertise, but it's very easy to say, oh, the problem's too big, or it's government's responsibility. But I think we now have the power to make change. I think programs, you know, Hugh's Fish Fight was a great example of how a huge public could be mobilised about an issue and be passionate about it and know about it very quickly, based on, you know, somebody who, you know, did TV programmes about cooking and then suddenly brought the common fisheries policy and discards and all quite unwieldy. And I think one of the things that it's very easy as a scientist is to get bogged down in the technicality and the jargon and the acronyms and the complexity, because it's not simple. But the fact is that we can make choices now. We can ask questions, and I think it is changing. And I think when we talk to the suppliers of fish and to make sure they're sustainable to feed the penguins at the zoo, obviously, having a lot of fish consumers within the organisation, you know, they actually now are getting used to being asked those questions and respond to them, and can introduce policies that expand beyond their organisation. And if we don't start somewhere, then we are stuffed. So we have to get on with it and do everything we can.